This is WWIU on location in the mobile studio, right? Oh shit, we just lost our studio. It was, yeah, we do now. It's a mobile studio. Definitely not the perfect recording. Anyway, so we're gonna share about where we just came from. This whole WWIU, which way is up, was kind of reflecting misinformation, and like we just heard, the war on information, where a lot of times most people don't know what is true or false, what's right or wrong, or which way is up. So we came from a screening of a documentary called The War on Cuba.
Yes.
Right? By a journal. What are they? They're journalists, right?
Do you want me to? I have a little.
Oh, yeah. Do you think?
The War on Cuba is an award-winning documentary series, executive produced by Oliver Stone and Danny Glover, that takes an in-depth look at the economic war waged by the U.S. government on the Cuban people. Liz Oliva Fernandez's intimate and incisive reporting opens our eyes to an issue that has received scant coverage by major media outlets in the United States.
We're not new to the documentary, and we're not new to Belly of the Beast Cuba. We had been following them for a while because we found what they had to say was an interesting perspective, because it was reporting coming from inside Cuba.
Yes.
As opposed to what we're used to in the United States when it comes to what's going on in Cuba as far as the people, the politics, the government.
Right.
We get our information from Miami. And
that's such a reliable source.
Right. But, growing up being so propagandized in this country,
yes.
We never thought to question any of this shit.
Exactly.
And so what really caught my interest with the documentary a couple years ago, I think it was like 2 years ago when we first started seeing clips online, was they would go and they would show clips of what politicians are saying in this country, Cuban American politicians in Miami and Union City, or just in DC as far as the federal government, and their claims to be worried about the people of Cuba and a humanitarian crisis that's being caused by their government. And they kind of go back and forth with what's actually happening on the ground in Cuba, contradicts the stories that we are getting here. And it made me reflect on the stories that I've gotten my whole life.
No, absolutely.
And really started to question things. You're in agreement, I'm sure. You want to share a little bit of what...
No, I mean, totally. I think that, basically it boils down to the contradiction that is what the U.S. government says their concern is versus what their actions say. For a country that is concerned with, the humanitarian crisis allegedly in Cuba,
so-called air quotes,
they do a lot of damage to humanity in Cuba through the policies that they hold and enact. I think that's basically what the entire documentary series, The War on Cuba, is about. Highlighting how what the U.S. government says and what they actually do is two different things.
Right. Primarily the impact of the blockade.
Yes. How the Cuban people see and define the blockade versus how it's played out in U.S. media, which then impacts how, us U.S. citizens see and end up. What was interesting about the event that we attended this evening was that there was a Q&A with the guy. I'm not sure if he was the director, the producer, I don't know what he was, or one of the filmmakers, and then the actual, journalist that reports in the documentary, Liz Olivas Fernandez, who is Cuban and, lives there and is, has always lived there and is educated there. And just to hear her talk about her experience as an Afro-Latina in Cuba.
Right.
One of the most poignant stories that she, because then there was a Q&A with the audience and somebody asked for her to try to define how even racism what's the difference between racism in the U.S. and in Cuba? And she was like, I'll just, she's like, my partner is from Boston, USA. She was like, out in Cuba, if a police officer asks me for my ID, that she'll basically be like, why? Whatever,
Right.
that
she'd be mouthing off.
Right, because, and she's like, and, we talk with our hands, which is a very Latino thing, right? And so that's very common, whereas her partner will be like, oh, that's a police officer, and become like, paralyzed and still, and, needs to be respectful and needs to obey. And she was like, why are you being like that? Like, it's not, so she used that example to depict how, there might be a lot of rhetoric around, oh, there's racism in Cuba. She didn't deny it,
right.
But she said is very different
right.
than the racism here.
Nothing compared.
Yeah. She was, so that to me was very poignant in her sharing. What also stood out to me was a point that she made about how she didn't want for people to watch the documentary and then like feel sorry for the Cuban people. And trust me, when you watch it, you do not feel sorry for them, because you see how strong and resilient they are, and you see how rooted they are in who they are as a country and as a people, and how they really look each other out, and they're not looking for handouts, and they're not looking for pity or what have you. They survive.
Right. She emphasized we just want to be left alone.
Yeah.
Right.
She was like, we wish we didn't have to be so resilient, but thank God that we can be. So and that hit home with me because I heard a lot of the same sentiment, especially after Hurricane Maria. After everything that people have been through in Puerto Rico, I heard a lot of the same sentiment. It was like, okay, yeah, we're going to raise our voices. We're going to demand what we need to demand from our government. But when they can't deliver, we're not going to sit here and feel sorry for ourselves. And we're going to demand what is our right. But at the end of the day, we're going to do what we have to do, And I was telling Scott that, a lot of us could not live that life on the island. A lot of us could not live life in Cuba because we are so entitled. Yeah. We are so privileged. We want everything at our fingertips. And if we have to struggle or work for anything, it's immediately a problem. If anything, I admire their strength as a people and how they're constantly providing all kinds of resources, especially medical resources, to the world, and how yet they receive little to no support from the world. And I will leave it at that.
And a lot of people don't even realize the work that Cuba does with their doctors, their medical professionals, their scientists, as far as a mutual aid effort to
help. Are a scientific and medical force to be reckoned with on this planet.
Yes.
And nobody knows that.
Right. And that's all by design.
Of course.
The embargo, which I like to refer to it as the blockade, has been in place for over 60 years since the Kennedy administration. Mm-hmm. And over the years, both Republican and Democrat administrations have tightened the screws on the embargo, making it harder. And basically how the embargo appears to me is an economic chokehold on a country or a region designed for it to make the government collapse and have to reach out to the great US of A for intervention, as they call it. And I think I told you this. I shared this with you a couple years ago in 2021, and we'll bring up why 2021 is important too. But in 2021, I was watching an interview with three people, and well, let me just say, in 2021, COVID really started to hit Cuba because it didn't initially like it did the rest of the world. Mm-hmm. Especially, I think they said they had like 126 deaths in 2020 when we were like
500,000.
Yeah, 500,000 or whatever. So there was a moment where, being that the Trump administration tightened the screws, saying that Cuba has been labeled as a sponsor of international terrorism, which just made the intensity of the embargo that much worse. So I'm watching this segment where they're talking about there was a quick uprising in Cuba. They were protesting the government, right? And that's something that doesn't happen. That hasn't happened in Cuba since before the revolution. So it got a lot of attention. And what they were explaining in the documentary was that was mainly because of COVID, the impact of COVID at the time. They were having blackouts. There was shortage of medicine. It was intensified.
Right.
And it wasn't like what they were used to. So I'm watching this segment. And in this segment, they had three people. They had one white guy. He was from the States, living in Havana. He was a journalist. Mm-hmm. They had another journalist, European, in Europe. Mm-hmm. And they had a Cuban American activist in Miami.
I remember this
clip. So the journalist in Miami that was living in Miami, he was contradicting the narrative, what was being told to us, that the Cuban people were sick and tired, and they were protesting the government, and they wanted to overthrow the government. That was the impression that we were getting. And he was like, yeah, no, I'm not seeing that. You know,
the guy in Havana.
The guy in Havana. Mm-hmm. The white guy in Havana, because I want to emphasize that, right?
Right.
So when he was saying that, the woman, the young lady, the Cuban American, was snapping at him, cutting him off, right? And she was really charged up. She's an activist. She's speaking for the Cuban people. And she's kind of like laying down her status, like, these are my people.
Right.
You don't understand, because, basically he's a white man. And, and I know my people. I know the word that I'm getting from Cuba. And he just kept insisting. He's like, I understand what you're hearing in Miami, but I'm telling you, I'm here, and I'm letting you know what I see, and what I hear. So there was some back and forth or whatever, and they came to understanding, all three of them. No, they didn't come to understanding, but they were looking for a compromise, and they were talking about the embargo, right? And they were saying, would it be fair? And they're presenting this to the activists from Miami. Would it be fair if the embargo would be modified in a way to start lightening up on the sanctions and allowing the Cuban people to get some of the necessary supplies that they need in order to improve their living conditions? Right? Would that be a fair compromise? The woman that was in Miami was like, no, absolutely not. My people want this regime overturned. It was like an all or nothing deal. And you know what? In that moment, when she, like, speaking for the Cuban people, like she said, but from the luxury of Miami,
of course,
living in Miami, and and of course it was just a hypothetical, but it's something to just point out. But she just literally shut it down, and I thought to myself, if I'm a Cuban living in Cuba, and I hear of a potential compromise and a modification of the conditions of the embargo, which is going to start allowing us to get medicine, necessary materials, things like that, in order for us to start to live and then hopefully at one point begin to thrive, then I'm going to take it.
Of course.
And here she is shutting it down, and it just showed me that her perspective, being in Miami, being a Cuban American, being propagandized as we were, because she wasn't even 30 years old. She was young. And to just say, no, we want to overturn the government, and that's it. You know what I'm saying? And and it just dawned on me, wow, that's how deep we're propagandized. And sometimes the Cuban American population in Miami or Union City or whatever will try to throw their status at us as having a better understanding of what's going on in the ground in Cuba. And the reality is that the only people that really understand that is their ancestors, their grandparents or whatever that fled Cuba or whatever, and they only have their version of the understanding. And what's happening in this documentary and what the mission is of Belly of the Beast Cuba is to start really sharing the perspective of what's going on on the ground with the actual people of Cuba.
And how the blockade impacts their day-to-day lives.
Because we're led to believe that communism is the reason why they're struggling like that. And they've admitted that their government is imperfect. They've struggled because communism and socialism is an experimental economic and governing system which we always hear that it doesn't work, it collapsed, it turns into dictatorships, but we never hear that every place that has so-called quote unquote failed because of communism and socialism has been heavily sanctioned by the United States. Right? So what it did to me was it made me want to question, particularly with Cuba, right? What if there were modifications to the blockade, or if the blockade was removed at all? I mean, removed altogether. And considering how resilient Cubans have become under the conditions of the blockade, imagine how they would be able to thrive.
Something as simple as opening up tourism.
Exactly.
That's like a whole episode in and of itself in the documentary series, is what happens when you open up tourism, which Obama did, and then Trump shut it down. And basically, the private sector in Cuba and people's ability to just, provide for themselves and their families and their loved ones went down the drain.
And that's a perfect example of compromise, because when Obama lightened up those restrictions and allowed the private sector and the Cuban government allowed the private sector to come in, which is a no-no under socialism and communism. Yeah. But they recognized their own circumstances and need for survival, that they would have to modify their own position in order to survive and get out of the circumstances that they're in.
Yeah.
But like you said, Trump came in and was really focused on appealing to the Florida voters, which, is, as I just mentioned, with that young lady in that interview, that there's no compromise, right? And Florida likes to hear that zero tolerance, no compromise type of stance coming from the U.S. politicians and their policy with Cuba.
Yeah.
So I really, really enjoyed that. We're gonna, we were doing it before. It was like sharing some clips, because if anybody just took a couple minutes to watch some of these clips, they're really attention grabbing, eye-opening type of clips, especially for those of us that we've been listening to Miami and that perspective, or the federal government and what they had to say, and making us think that it's a humanitarian crisis that's being caused by the Cuban government, when that's just not the truth.
It's a humanitarian crisis being caused by the U.S. government.
Exactly. And like I said, the Cuban government has admitted that they are not perfect. They've struggled with leadership, handling the economy, or whatever, but that barely would make a dent as compared to the impact that the embargo is having on Cuban people.
Absolutely.
So
we need to do events like that more often, and then do stuff like this where we share with everyone. Right
on location. We just left Manhattan. It was the Firehouse Theater, which was an actual DCTV, which was an actual damn firehouse with a theater in it, where they only show documentaries like the one that we saw tonight. So I really enjoyed that. So going forward, WWIU, we've been on a hiatus. This is mainly my fault. I'm trying
no fault, just
not fault. Yeah, I'm really responsible for most of that, even though you supported me on the decision.
It was a good reason to go on hiatus.
Life stuff, getting life affairs in order, which is an ongoing process with me. But we never intended on letting WWIU go at all. So there's a big gap right now as far as the last time we recorded, and this is also like a catching up and an update. So we do intend to move forward. We are not going to commit ourselves to a certain time frame or schedule. We've learned better from that. But one thing we're going to do is keep it more simple. We're not going to be doing damn 90-minute shows or whatever. We're going to try. But
once we get to talking.
Yeah, once we get to yapping, this one gets to yapping. Sometimes the magic just continues to flow.
You know what?
What?
You be yapping too.
A little bit, but that's called chemistry. That's called chemistry.
You're right.
So, and even if we do go long, 90 minutes or whatever, we're gonna chop it up.
There you go.
And we're gonna give different parts or whatever.
Wizard
because I don't think any of you are sitting down listening to us for 90 minutes straight. You might break it down into segments yourself. So yeah. Anything else? Any last words to close out this short episode?
Nothing. Just I'm glad to be back. I'm glad that we're back, and more to come.
We're gonna actually include links for the on YouTube for the documentary, and links for Belly of the Beast Cuba, on Instagram and YouTube as well, so you can see for yourself what we're talking about. That was one thing that was talked about in the Q&A session of how we can support their movement and their work and what we're doing, and they basically said share and help educate people.
Yes.
So, and that's kind of what we try to do with this podcast.
That's what we're doing right now.
That's what we're doing right now. So as always, I'm Scott.
I'm Michi.
We out.
Bye.
Peace.